What if I told you that right now a movement is rising across Africa? One that could completely erase the borders drawn by colonial powers. A movement that calls for a single leader to represent the entire continent. And that leader is none other than Captain Ibrahim Traore, the young revolutionary from Burkina Faso. But before you think this is just another headline or a symbolic gesture, hold on. Because this story goes much deeper. And to understand how we reached this point, we have to go back, way back. After the first minute, we'll explore how Africa's leadership became so divided that it gave birth to the idea of one man leading all 54 nations under one flag. But let's start with what's happening right now. According to a petition on change.org titled Advocate for Captain Ibrahim Traore as Single Leader for a Borderless Africa, thousands of Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, have signed to dissolve the colonial borders and unite under Traore's leadership. The petition argues that divided leadership has led to disparities in growth, development, and equality, calling for a single currency, a unified flag, and a new African identity beyond the lines imposed by Europe. It describes Traore as fearless and incorruptible, a leader who has achieved in 2 years what others couldn't in 3 decades, and who survived more than 30 assassination attempts. He even declared with his own mouth, "I'm not scared of death. My death will pay the ultimate price for my people." But what made this 36-year-old captain such a powerful symbol? And why do thousands of African youths see him as the man who can finally finish what leaders like Thomas Sankara and Kwame Nkrumah started? According to Pambazuka News' report, Solidarity Protests for President Traore, a March for Africa's Future, by Ernesto Yeboah and Mwangi Assembly. Demonstrations erupted across the continent in April 2025, from Accra to Nairobi and from Ouagadougou to Johannesburg. These weren't protests for democracy or against military rule. They were something different, a Pan-African awakening, a call for unity that challenges the narrative pushed by Western institutions. Ernesto Yeboah wrote that reducing the support for Traore to a democracy versus military junta debate is a desperate and simplistic attempt to undermine a grassroots revolution led by Africa's youth. So here's the real question. Why now? Why does Africa's new generation, born decades after independence, suddenly rally behind one soldier? Could this be the consequence of years of Western interference, failed democracy models, and the disillusionment with the so-called development aid from Washington and the European Union? Or is this something even deeper, a spiritual, historical reckoning with Africa's stolen destiny? To truly understand how we got here, we have to go back to the end of colonialism and the beginning of what some call the second colonization, the economic and political control of Africa through debt, aid, and dependency. From the International Monetary Fund to the World Bank, and from Paris to Brussels, policies disguised as partnerships have shaped Africa's leadership for decades. They divided economies, militaries, and identities, ensuring that no African leader could ever rise too high without being labeled a threat. But now, something different is happening. The youth, the same generation that grew up connected through the internet, no longer sees Burkina Faso as just a small West African nation. They see it as a symbol, a spark, the beginning of what some call the new African revolution. A revolution where leaders are chosen not by Western approval, but by African will. And yet, the West is watching. Because if this movement grows, if Ibrahim Traore truly becomes the face of a borderless Africa, it could shake the global balance of power. Imagine an Africa with one flag, one currency, one army. An Africa that no longer asks permission from the IMF, no longer depends on aid from Brussels or Washington. For some, this is a dream. For others, a nightmare. So the question remains, is this the dawn of a new Pan-African era? Or the rise of another global confrontation, where Africa once again becomes the battlefield of foreign interests? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain, the youth have spoken, and their message is loud and clear. Africa must unite, and Ibrahim Traore might just be the man to lead it. To understand how Africa reached this turning point, where millions are ready to rally behind one man, we have to rewind the clock to the moment when the dream of African unity was first born and then buried. Because this idea of one Africa, didn't begin with Ibrahim Traore. It began long before with figures like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and Muammar Gaddafi, leaders who all shared the same vision: a united Africa free from the grip of foreign powers. But every time that vision emerged, something or someone made sure it died before it could take shape. The question is, who kept killing the idea of a united continent? According to historical accounts and declassified documents, each of these leaders who tried to unite Africa faced the same fate: either assassination, coup d'état, or international isolation. Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966 while visiting Beijing. Lumumba was executed with Western complicity. Sankara was betrayed by his own inner circle, and Gaddafi, who proposed an African Union with a single currency backed by gold, was bombed in 2011 under a NATO operation approved by the very leaders who claimed to support African democracy. Now, years later, a young soldier from Burkina Faso, inspired by Sankara's legacy, steps forward with a similar message. And suddenly, the world takes notice again. But this time it's different, because the people are not waiting for politicians. They are mobilizing themselves. The Change.org petition calling for a borderless Africa under Traore isn't just symbolic. It represents a generation tired of waiting for the so-called Agenda 2063 of the African Union, an agenda that promised prosperity by the year 2063, but has delivered little progress. The petition argues that if 100,000 signatures are gathered, the idea of uniting under Traore could accelerate that agenda to 2030, or even sooner. Think about that. People no longer believe bureaucratic institutions will save them. They believe only radical leadership can. And that's where the controversy begins. Because according to analysts cited in the Guardian Africa Review, Washington and Brussels are growing increasingly uncomfortable with Traore's growing influence. He speaks of sovereignty, independence, and self-defense, words that sound revolutionary to Africans, but threatening to Western capitals. One European diplomat reportedly said off record, "Traore is unpredictable. He doesn't follow the script." But what script are they talking about? The one that kept Africa dependent on foreign aid, divided by borders and paralyzed by debt? If we connect the dots, we can see the pattern. Whenever an African leader talks about uniting the continent or taking control of its resources, narratives start to shift. Suddenly, Western media labels them dictators, military rulers, or populists. It's a classic playbook. The same one used against Gaddafi and Sankara is now being deployed against Traore. But the question remains, why does unity scare the world so much? Because a united Africa would mean control over 60% of the world's arable land, 30% of global mineral reserves, and the youngest population on Earth. It would mean energy independence, resource control, and a new global voice, one that cannot be ignored by Washington, Beijing, or Brussels. In other words, it would mean power. And that's something the current global order isn't ready to share. So when we look at the thousands marching in solidarity with Traore from Accra to Bamako to Addis Ababa, this isn't just about one leader. It's about a collective awakening. As Pambazuka News noted, these protests are not for Traore, but with him. A movement that says Africa no longer needs permission to define its destiny. And that's precisely what makes it dangerous to those who profit from its division. But here's a question we must all ask ourselves. Can one man, no matter how fearless, truly unite 1.4 billion people under one flag? Or is this movement destined to be crushed by the same global powers that silenced its predecessors? To answer that, we'll need to go deeper, to the silent wars happening right now across the continent, where influence, ideology, and ambition collide. Because behind the dream of a borderless Africa lies a geopolitical chessboard few dare to see. To understand the geopolitical storm surrounding this movement, we must enter the shadows, the hidden side of African politics, where alliances are fragile and loyalty often has a price. Because as Traore rises as a symbol of African unity, he also becomes a target in one of the most complex power struggles of the 21st century. And to grasp the full picture, we have to look at what's happening behind closed doors in Washington, Paris, and even within the African Union itself. According to multiple reports cited by Africa Intelligence and GenAfric, the rise of Ibrahim Traore has sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Washington views him as a disruptive force, while Paris considers him a direct threat to French influence in West Africa. Ever since Burkina Faso expelled French troops and shut down French military bases, the country has become the beating heart of a new anti-imperialist alliance, one that openly rejects foreign control and calls for sovereignty through unity. But here's where things get interesting. This is not just about the West losing influence. It's about who's gaining it. Sources from the Continental Observer indicate that both Moscow and Beijing have quietly strengthened their relations with Burkina Faso, offering economic aid, defense cooperation, and infrastructure support, all under the banner of partnership, not control. The symbolism is powerful. While Western nations criticize Traore's governance, Eastern powers are building roads, training engineers, and signing mining agreements. It's not charity, it's strategy. Because whoever wins Africa's trust today will control tomorrow's world economy. Yet even within Africa, Traore's rise divides opinions. Some leaders see him as the embodiment of Pan-African hope, the man willing to challenge the global order. Others see him as a threat to their own power. After all, united Africa under one flag would mean the end of political dynasties, the collapse of elite monopolies, and the rewriting of national constitutions. So the question becomes, who truly supports unity? And who fears losing control? A leaked memo reported by African Affairs Review suggests that discussions within the African Union have quietly shifted. Some member states allegedly proposed creating a Federation Council, a transitional structure that could coordinate military, economic, and political integration between nations led by revolutionary movements, starting with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. If that's true, this would be the first concrete step toward a united African Federation, a concept that until now existed only in speeches and books. But of course, not everyone is happy about that. Western analysts warn that this movement could destabilize the region. But destabilize what exactly? The dependency, the control, or the illusion that Africa can't rise without supervision? Traore's supporters argue that instability is not caused by liberation, but by resistance to it. And if we examine history, that argument holds weight. Every time Africa tried to stand alone from Lumumba to Sankara, the backlash was immediate, fierce, and often deadly. But this time, the battlefield has changed. Information travels faster. Youth movements are more organized, and the hunger for self-determination runs deeper than ever. Pambazuka News highlighted how young Africans no longer trust political institutions. They trust symbols. And Traore has become that symbol not because he's perfect, but because he represents defiance in a world that wants obedience. Still, there's an unspoken question lurking beneath all this. What if this dream succeeds? What if a borderless Africa is not just a fantasy, but a blueprint? One that could inspire revolutions from Latin America to the Middle East. Could this be the moment when the global South finally reclaims its voice? Or will the same forces that silenced Nkrumah and Sankara find new ways to crush this awakening? We are witnessing a crossroads, a moment when history could be rewritten or erased once again. But to truly understand what's at stake, we need to follow the money, the resources, and the influence. Because behind every revolution lies an economy, and behind every visionary speech lies a struggle for control of gold, oil, and power. And that's where the real war begins, the invisible war for Africa's soul. If you truly want to understand this silent war, you must follow what the media rarely talks about, the resources. Because behind every political revolution, there's always an economic reason hidden in plain sight. And in the case of Ibrahim Traore's rise, the center of the conflict isn't just ideology or governance. It's about who controls Africa's gold, uranium, lithium, and oil. To understand why his leadership terrifies the global establishment, we have to trace how the continent's wealth became both its curse and its weapon. According to African Economic Review and the mining journal Africa, Burkina Faso holds one of the largest untapped gold reserves in West Africa. Yet for decades, foreign corporations extracted billions while the local population remained in poverty. When Traore came to power, he didn't just promise reforms. He demanded national control. He expelled several foreign mining firms suspected of corruption and redirected a portion of Burkina Faso's gold revenue into public welfare and defense. To the people, this was justice. To the West, it was provocation. Because gold isn't just a resource. It's a currency of power. Whoever controls it controls leverage. But gold is only part of the story. Analysts from the Pan-African Economic Forum report that the Sahel region, stretching from Mali to Niger, sits atop a massive reserve of uranium and lithium, both essential for nuclear energy and electric vehicles. Now ask yourself, why are Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, three nations rich in these materials, the same ones facing coups, sanctions, and external interference? Coincidence or design? After these nations cut military and diplomatic ties with Paris, forming their own alliance known as the Alliance of Sahel States, EES, they began coordinating trade, defense, and diplomacy independently. In response, Western institutions froze aid, the European Union imposed restrictions, and Washington issued warnings about regional instability. But again, instability for whom? Let's look at the facts. According to data from Energy Global Index 2025, Niger supplies over 25% of the uranium used by France's nuclear reactors, which power more than 70% of the French energy grid. When Niger's new leadership decided to suspend exports and renegotiate contracts, France's energy costs immediately surged. That's when TRAORE made his move, declaring solidarity with Niger and Mali, calling their struggle the foundation of African dignity. Shortly after, the three nations announced plans to create a joint central bank and possibly a new regional currency, independent from the CFA franc, a colonial-era system still controlled by the French treasury. This, according to Le Monde Afrique, was the moment alarm bells rang in European capitals. But there's another side to this. While Western governments label these moves as anti-democratic, several African economists argue they're economically logical. As Dr. Ousmane Diarra from the University of Dakar told Pambazuka News, for the first time in modern history, African nations are trying to decide the value of their own money, their own minerals, and their own destiny. That's not rebellion, that's sovereignty. Still, sovereignty has a price. Intelligence sources cited by Global Security Monitor claim that since late 2024, at least 5 coup plots and 30 assassination attempts have been uncovered against TRAORE and his allies. The methods vary: political infiltration, disinformation, and even economic sabotage. Some of these plots were allegedly backed by external actors trying to reinstall pro-Western administrations under the guise of democracy restoration. But TRAORE himself said it best: "I am not scared of death. My death will pay the ultimate price for my people." So the bigger question is this: is Africa finally breaking free from foreign control, or simply shifting from one empire's grip to another?